April 12, 1878. The city was alive with carriages, gas lamps, and the restless hum of fortune. On Fifth Avenue, where the brownstone facades rose like monuments to vanity, a young woman leaned from her balcony, her silk gown catching the evening breeze. Her name was Isabella Harrow, though to society she was simply Belle. She was 21, recently introduced to New York's inner circle of wealth, and already hailed as one of the brightest stars of the Gilded Age. Newspapers called her the girl with the sapphire eyes. Ballrooms echoed with whispers of her beauty and her inheritance. Men envied her suitors, women copied her gowns, and society itself bent slightly in her presence. Belle was the only daughter of shipping magnate Jonathan Harrow, whose fleet of steamships had tied New York to the world. The Harrow fortune was newer than Astor money, but large enough to command respect. Her mother, Margaret, was obsessed with presentation. Every hairpin, every pearl, every stitch of Belle's wardrobe was curated not for comfort, but for conquest. She had raised her daughter to shine in salons, to dazzle at dinners, to be seen but never stained by the grit of ordinary life. That evening, Belle prepared for the Vanderbilt ball, a spectacle rumored to cost more than most men earned in a lifetime. As servants laced her corset tighter, she imagined the room of chandeliers, the endless champagne, the orchestra swelling as she entered. She lived for these nights, not because she loved dancing or laughter, but because they were proof of her ascendancy. Every glance, every nod from an Astor or a Belmont was another brick in the empire of her reputation. But beneath the glitter, Belle carried a gnawing emptiness she could not name. Sometimes, late at night when the candles had burned down, she heard a faint hum in her mind, as if an invisible chorus were singing to her alone. Other nights, she paced her room until dawn, her body exhausted, but her mind racing with strange visions, the marble steps of her home melting like wax, the faces of her guests twisting into grotesque masks, her own reflection whispering secrets she couldn't quite understand. She told no one. In her world, a woman could lose money, she could lose a husband, but she could not lose her mind. Madness was exile. At the Vanderbilt ball, Belle outshone them all. Her gown was silver-threaded silk, her jewels sapphires that glittered like captured stars. Men lined up for her hand in the quadrille, women bowed with polite smiles that hid their envy. Alva Vanderbilt herself leaned in to compliment her. For Belle, it was intoxicating. Every laugh she gave felt like a command, every movement, a coronation. She was untouchable, eternal, and yet as midnight drew near, the hum returned, louder this time. The chandeliers above seemed to sway, though no wind touched them. Faces blurred and sharpened, blurred and sharpened. A gentleman asked her to dance, but his voice sounded distant, stretched like an echo in a cavern. Her hands trembled as she placed them in his. As they circled the floor, she felt the walls closing in, the ceiling pressing lower. For a moment, panic threatened to overtake her, but then applause erupted. The dance was over, and she was radiant again. She smiled, bowed and drank champagne until dawn, smothering the terror under layers of charm. Back home, alone in her vast room, she collapsed into her velvet chair, her sapphire necklace cut into her skin, but she did not remove it. Instead, she stared into the mirror. Her reflection smiled back at her, though she had not moved her lips. It tilted its head when she did not. She froze, her breath quickened. The reflection whispered her name, soft, seductive and certain. Belle, 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 Belle. She screamed, shattering the silence, summoning her maid. But when the maid rushed in, the mirror showed nothing unusual, just Isabella Harrow, flushed and trembling, in her jeweled gown. Belle dismissed her with a wave, muttering something about fatigue. When the door closed, she laughed to herself, a brittle laugh that echoed too long in the empty room. She would never mention it again. From that night forward, the visions returned with greater insistence. At breakfast, she would see her father's face shift into a skull. At the opera, she would hear the orchestra playing a melody no one else seemed to notice, a tune that twisted and warped until she wanted to cover her ears and scream. She hid it well. The Harrows had a reputation to uphold, and Belle was its crown jewel. But already, the cracks had begun. November 3rd. The autumn wind rattled the iron gates of the Harrow mansion as Belle stepped into her carriage, her gloved hands clenching tighter than usual. She had grown thinner, though society pages still described her as radiant. Radiance was expected. Radiance was survival. Inside, however, shadows had begun to take root. Her father had arranged a dinner that night with the Belmonts, a chance to secure influence with banking circles. Belle, now 23, was not only a social figure but an investment in the Harrow name. She understood this role. She was the trophy, the promise, the dazzling face of a family fortune built on steel and steam, and she played it perfectly. At the dinner table, laughter echoed over silver plates and crystal goblets. Belle charmed the room with her wit, her laughter ringing like music. Yet, as she lifted her wine glass, she saw a streak of crimson sliding down its edge, thick, almost alive. She gasped and nearly dropped it, but in the next blink, it was gone, just crystal clear and cold. She smiled, steadying herself, and raised a toast as though nothing had happened. When guests departed, her father clasped her shoulder with pride. "You're the jewel of this family, Belle. Never forget that." But alone, she felt less like a jewel and more like glass, fragile, cracking under unseen pressure. That night, she wandered the halls of the mansion, candle in hand. The portraits of ancestors seemed to leer at her, their painted eyes glinting with judgment. In the gallery, she stopped before a canvas of her grandmother, a stern-faced woman in black lace. Belle swore she saw the lips curve upward in a sneer. She staggered back, nearly toppling the candelabra. The flame wavered, casting monstrous shadows across the walls. She fled to her room, locking the door behind her. Sleep did not come. Instead, voices did. Low murmurs, threading through the silence. Sometimes they sang, sometimes they scolded. She pressed her hands to her ears until they hurt, but the voices lived inside her skull. They told her she was weak, that she was being watched, that her downfall was certain. She whispered back, begging them to stop. By winter, the whispers had followed her into society. At a ball given by the Astors, Belle stood frozen in the middle of the dance floor, convinced every guest was staring, whispering about her. She laughed too loudly, clutched too tightly at her partner's arm, and excused herself early. Gossip began to circulate. "She seems unsteady," someone said within earshot. Her cheeks burned. Her mother noticed. Margaret confronted her one morning, voice sharp as cut glass. "You are not yourself, Belle. You look worn. People will talk. Do not give them reason to." Belle wanted to scream that she was drowning, that her mind was unraveling, that voices haunted her, and shadows twisted around her vision. But instead she nodded, smiled faintly, and promised to rest. The truth was unthinkable. To admit madness was to be cast out, exiled from the very stage her mother had raised her to dominate. Then came Edward. He was tall, charming, and from one of Boston's oldest families. Their courtship was swift, accelerated by the insistence of her parents. He admired her beauty, her grace, her practiced charm. She admired his name and the security it offered. For a brief moment, she thought marriage might anchor her, give her mind something solid to cling to. Their engagement was announced with fanfare. Newspapers printed her portrait. The mansion was flooded with congratulations. But inside, Belle was unraveling faster. During fittings for her wedding gown, she fainted twice. Once, she awoke screaming, convinced the seamstress had sewn spiders into the fabric. At dinners with Edward, she drifted in and out of conversations, distracted by the hum of phantom music in her ears. Edward laughed it off at first, calling her dreamy, but his smile grew thin. On the night of their engagement ball, Belle stood before the crowd in a gown of ivory silk, diamonds glittering at her throat. The orchestra swelled, and Edward offered his arm. She took it, forcing a smile. But as they descended the staircase, the room shifted. The chandeliers dripped wax like blood. The faces below melted into grotesque masks, their mouths gaping in silent laughter. Belle froze. The hum in her mind surged into a roar. She stumbled, gripping the banister. Gasps rose from the crowd. Edward whispered urgently, "Belle, what's wrong?" She heard her name echoing, but not from him, from everywhere, from nowhere. "Belle, Belle, Belle." Her knees buckled. The diamonds cut into her skin as she collapsed, consciousness fleeing. When she awoke, she was in her room, her mother beside her, expression pinched with fury. "You embarrassed us," Margaret hissed. "Do you understand what you've done? People will remember this." Belle tried to speak, but tears choked her. Within weeks, Edward withdrew. His family cited her fragile health. The engagement was quietly dissolved. Society whispered louder now. The jewel of the Harrows was tarnished. Her father buried himself in work, her mother in silence. Belle was left to pace the gilded halls alone, haunted by whispers only she could hear. By spring, she no longer trusted mirrors. Too often, her reflection moved when she did not. And yet, despite it all, the city still invited her. Parties, operas, teas, her name still carried weight. She continued to attend, her smile perfectly painted, her gowns perfectly chosen. Only those who looked closely noticed the cracks. Only those who cared to listen heard her laughter ring hollow. Inside, Belle knew she was slipping, but she also knew this: no one could ever find out. Rain streaked down the windows of the Harrow mansion, turning the city outside into a blur of grey and gold. Inside, Belle paced her room barefoot, her silk dressing gown trailing across the carpet. She had not slept in 2 nights. The voices had grown louder, sharper, no longer content to murmur from the shadows of her mind. They called her by name, demanded her attention, accused her of sins she had not committed. When she pressed her hands to her ears, the voices only laughed. Her mother had stopped asking questions. After the broken engagement, Margaret avoided her daughter entirely, speaking of her only when necessary. "Isabella is unwell," she told acquaintances with a clipped tone. "The doctors are attending to her." The doctors had come, and they had prescribed rest cures and tonics, chalking her visions up to female nerves. They insisted she lie still for hours, fed her laudanum until her thoughts blurred into fog. But the fog did not quiet the voices, it only made them crueler. At night, they whispered of betrayal, warning her that the servants plotted against her, that her parents despised her, that the world would soon know the truth. She was mad. One evening, Belle wandered into her father's library. Jonathan Harrow sat at his desk, spectacles perched on his nose, reading a ledger. He looked up at her with a mixture of irritation and unease. She rarely sought him out anymore. "Father," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Yes?" His tone was clipped, distracted. "They're watching me." His brow furrowed. "Who?" "The portraits, the servants, everyone. I can hear them. They won't leave me alone." He removed his spectacles and sighed heavily. "Isabella, enough. You're exhausting your mother. You're exhausting this family. People are talking. Do you understand the danger?" "I'm not lying," she pleaded. "I swear it." He slammed the ledger shut. "No more of this. You will follow the doctor's orders. You will rest. And for God's sake, you will compose yourself in public. Do you understand me?" Tears welled in her eyes. She nodded silently and slipped out of the room. Behind her, her father muttered under his breath, "Madness, God help us." The days blurred into weeks. Invitations still arrived, though fewer now. At teas and musicals, Belle forced her smile, though her hands trembled around porcelain cups. Once, at the opera, she erupted into sudden laughter during a tragic aria, convinced the soprano's voice was mocking her. Guests shifted uncomfortably. The Astors ceased including her name in their guest lists soon after. By the summer of 1882, she was no longer the jewel of New York society. She was an object of pity, a cautionary tale whispered in corridors. Such a shame, they said. She was so beautiful. Her father retreated deeper into business affairs. Her mother entertained discreetly without her. The mansion that once overflowed with visitors now echoed with silence. Belle wandered its vast halls alone, speaking to figures no one else could see. One night, she descended into the dining room, convinced a grand banquet was underway. She saw tables piled high with food, chandeliers blazing, guests seated in finery. She laughed and clapped, calling out names, only to find the room empty and dark. Servants discovered her hours later, dancing alone, her gown torn and her hair disheveled, twirling with an invisible partner. Her mother wept in private, begging her husband to take action. "We cannot keep her like this," Margaret whispered. "The shame will destroy us." Jonathan agreed. That autumn, Belle was sent to a private institution outside the city. The doctors there promised peace, treatment, recovery. The building was stark, with barred windows and endless corridors that smelled of disinfectant. Belle resisted at first, screaming as they dragged her through the gates, insisting she was not mad, that she was being tricked. But once confined, her energy drained. She sat for hours staring at the walls, lips moving in silent conversation with the unseen. The treatments were cruel. Cold baths, isolation, restraints, more laudanum, more tonics, until her body trembled constantly. Sometimes she raged against them, shrieking until her throat bled. Other times she lay silent, as though already dead. Her family visited only rarely. Her mother arrived once, weeping quietly but saying little. Her father came only to sign papers. Soon, even those visits ceased. The Harrows spoke of her less and less, as though she had already vanished. Yet Belle endured. Even in that place she clung to fragments of her old self. She told the nurses she would return, that one day the city would welcome her back, that she would wear her jewels again and laugh in the faces of those who doubted her. They humored her, nodding as they tightened her restraints. On her 26th birthday, she sat by the barred window, gazing at the grey sky. In her mind, she saw chandeliers blazing, carriages arriving, gowns sweeping across marble floors. She heard applause, laughter, music swelling. For a fleeting moment, she was radiant again, untouchable, eternal. Then the vision faded, and she was only Belle Harrow, alone in a room that smelled of disinfectant, her fortune useless, her name fading from the city's memory. The jewel of the Harrows was gone, only the husk remained. The summer heat pressed heavy against the stone walls of the institution, seeping into the halls where Belle Harrow now lived her endless days. She was 28 years old. The society pages no longer printed her name. The invitations had long since stopped. On Fifth Avenue, where she had once reigned in jewels and silk, her absence was hardly noticed. Another beauty, another fortune, another family had taken her place in the glittering hierarchy. Inside the asylum, time had a different rhythm. Days stretched endlessly, marked by the ringing of a bell for meals, for rest, for treatment. Belle rarely marked them. To her, the days bled together into one continuous haze of voices, visions, and silence. Some morning she awoke convinced she was still at home, reaching for her maid to help her dress for a ball. Only when the iron-barred window met her eyes did she remember where she truly was.
Her parents had stopped visiting altogether. The last time she saw them was 2 years earlier. Margaret sat stiffly in a chair, gloves still on, tears streaking her cheeks but refusing to speak. Jonathan stood by the window, arms crossed, expression carved from stone. When Belle tried to rise, tried to tell them she was ready to come home, her father only muttered, "You're not well," before leaving without another glance. After that silence, the Harrow name, once a crown upon her head, was now a chain she bore alone. The treatments had grown harsher. Doctors experimented with new methods, convinced her madness could be tamed by discipline. Ice baths left her shivering until her lips turned blue. Bleeding was attempted more than once. Laudanum still clouded her mind, but even that no longer dulled the voices. They had grown louder, bolder, crueler. They mocked her in the dark, urged her to scream, laughed when she obeyed. At times she fought back, shouting until the attendants restrained her. Other times she sat in eerie silence, her sapphire eyes staring through walls, lips moving in unheard conversations. Other patients drifted in and out of her orbit. Some cried endlessly, some muttered prayers, some stared at nothing at all. Belle watched them with a mixture of pity and recognition. She saw in their vacant expressions the mirror of her own. Clara was younger, fragile, with hair like spun gold, and a voice like a child. She believed she was a princess locked in a tower. Belle amused and comforted, humored her. They spoke of imaginary banquets, of gowns they would wear, of suitors waiting beyond the walls. For a time, Belle felt less alone, but Clara was transferred suddenly one morning, sent to another ward. Belle never saw her again. That winter, Belle fell ill with fever. In the delirium, she saw visions of chandeliers melting, walls bleeding, faces of her old acquaintances hovering above her bed. She called out to Edward, the man who had once promised her a future, but no one came. When she recovered weeks later, she was thinner, weaker, and the staff treated her more cautiously, as if expecting her to collapse again at any moment. And yet, through all of this, fragments of her old self still clung stubbornly. Sometimes, late at night, she would sit by the barred window and imagine the city beyond. She pictured herself in jewels, descending marble staircases, laughter trailing behind her. In those moments, she convinced herself this was all temporary, that she would be restored, that the city would bow once more when Isabella Harrow entered the room. But reality always returned. Letters from home no longer arrived. Gossip trickled into the asylum from nurses and attendants. Her father's fortune had been shaken by failed ventures. Her mother was seen less and less in public. The Harrows, once glittering, were now dim. Belle's disappearance had been absorbed into the great machine of society, a story told once, then forgotten. One night, she awoke to find her reflection staring at her from the window glass. Though the room was dark, it smiled when she did not. It tilted its head when she stayed still. "Belle," it whispered, soft and coaxing. Her breath caught in her throat. She pressed her palm against the glass, and the reflection pressed back. For the first time in years, she smiled, not the brittle smile of society, but something genuine, unhinged, wild. The nurses found her like that at dawn, still pressed against the window, whispering to herself. They shook their heads, muttered that she was lost, but Belle didn't hear them. In her mind, she was already elsewhere, at a ball that stretched on forever, music swelling, chandeliers blazing, laughter ringing. She twirled in her mind's eye, silk skirts swishing, diamonds glittering, eyes upon her once more. She was radiant again. By the end of 1885, she no longer responded to her name unless it was sung. The voices had become her true companions. Reality had slipped away, replaced by a kingdom only she could see. And so the jewel of the Harrows, once the brightest star of the Gilded Age, lived on in shadows, her brilliance consumed not by scandal or ruin, but by the silent, merciless grip of madness. Snow fell heavy on the grounds of the asylum, muffling the world in silence. Inside, the corridors were as cold as the stone walls that lined them. Isabella Harrow, once Belle, the jewel of Fifth Avenue, was 35 years old now. Her hair, once thick and dark, had streaks of grey. Her face, once printed in society pages, was hollowed, her beauty a ghostly memory. She had lived nearly a decade behind those barred windows. Most of the staff no longer remembered the society queen she had been. To them she was simply another patient, another faded figure wandering endless halls. Only one nurse, an older woman named Agnes, knew her history. On rare occasions, Agnes would sit beside her and whisper, "I heard you were the most beautiful woman in New York once." Belle would smile faintly, eyes glazed, as if the words were half forgotten. The Harrow fortune had crumbled. Jonathan Harrow died in 1889 after a failed business venture sank his fleet and ruined his reputation. Margaret Harrow sold the Fifth Avenue mansion quietly and withdrew from public life. She never returned to see her daughter, never wrote again. In the city, the name Harrow no longer commanded respect. It was a name people recalled only with hushed pity, if at all. Belle lived mostly inside her mind. Some days she paced for hours, muttering to voices only she could hear. Other days she sat by the window, hands folded, eyes distant, watching snowfall as though it were confetti at a grand ball. The doctors tried less now. She had outlasted their treatments, their ice baths, their tonics. They declared her incurable, a permanent resident. She was no longer a patient to be saved, but a body to be housed. In her own world, however, Belle was still radiant. She told the nurses she was invited to a ball that very evening. She described her gown in detail, silk, silver-threaded, sapphires at her throat. She rehearsed conversations with guests, imagined the chandeliers blazing, the orchestra swelling as she entered. She even laughed, the same brittle, charming laugh that once commanded attention in salons. But no guests arrived, no orchestra played. The ball existed only in her mind, and only she was invited. Her decline deepened with the years. She stopped eating for days at a time, claiming she had already dined at banquets too lavish for the nurses to imagine. Her body grew frail, her hands trembling constantly. Yet still she whispered to the voices. Still she smiled at her reflection when it moved without her. Still she clung to the fantasy that she was not forgotten. One evening, Agnes found her sitting in the corridor, humming softly to herself. "What are you singing, dear?" the nurse asked. "The music," Belle whispered. "Can't you hear it? They're playing for me. They're waiting." Agnes shook her head sadly. There was no music, only the sound of the wind howling through cracks in the old building. On the night of her death, January Turi Alphart, 1892, Belle lay in her narrow bed, her breath shallow. A storm rattled the windows, and the building groaned in the wind. Nurses hurried through the halls, but Belle hardly noticed. In her mind, she was back on Fifth Avenue, stepping into her carriage, silk gown flowing, jewels glittering. She saw chandeliers, laughter, applause. She saw her father proud, her mother smiling, Edward offering his arm. She saw herself radiant, untouchable, eternal. She whispered her own name, Belle, one last time, and then the light in her eyes faded. The nurses covered her body quietly. There was no grand announcement, no obituary in the Times, no city-wide mourning. Her death was recorded in a thin ledger, her body buried in a modest grave far from Fifth Avenue. No family attended. The mansion that once rang with laughter had already been sold to strangers. The fortune that once built steamships was gone. The city had moved on, as it always did. But for those who remembered, her story lingered. A tale whispered at dinner tables of the girl who had everything and lost it not to scandal, not to poverty, but to her own mind. A jewel that once outshone the chandeliers of New York, now buried in the shadows of madness. The Gilded Age had promised immortality to its brightest stars. For Belle Harrow, it delivered only tragedy.